Before we go any further, Charles, explain to me why there is water coming in your sound.
Yeah, well, we were chatting about this. One of the perennial issues, let's say, with recording these sorts of things between three people in three different places are the sound levels, which is terribly technical and I would say verging on dull. But it is an indication of the world we live in that there's no one way of doing stuff. And I don't know when that went wrong, but it is the constant bugbear of so many people, and yet that's how many businesses thrive, by making a product that doesn't conform with everybody else's and that doesn't do this, that and the other. And so you're forced down a particular route, which is a bit of a sidetrack, but it does raise the issue, as you say, that there is a sound you can probably hear in the background when I speak, and that is the noise of water. And I must say, I am delighted that that is the sound, because in the UK, and we've been talking about this on the news, we have been very, very short of water. And I think it's really indicative of, again, of the age. So my sort of tech mini rant is pertinent in that I think for the vast majority of people living in the UK, perhaps in the so-called developed world, whether or not it rains is just not something that people think about. I think it's a sort of, well, the weather's lovely. But in actual fact, there is a massive implication if it doesn't rain. And I keep track of this, keeping livestock and whatnot and needing things to grow at particular times. It's really important when stuff happens. But equally, it's a massive reminder of the requirement to work with and not against nature. And yet here we are, very, very short of water. In the UK, no provision for storage of water in proportion to the requirement. And what I mean by the requirement is that the UK's population has obviously gone up dramatically over the last few decades. Water shortages are now very much more to be something at least that water companies can talk about and sort of dangle over people and try to raise prices and all sorts against. But the truth of it is sort of somewhere in the middle, in that the way that water companies are run is beyond doubt very, very inefficient, very poor. The infrastructure is very badly managed, and I can say that with absolute certainty, having dealt with my own water company on very many occasions and found out exactly how poor their record keeping is, as indeed their maintenance of the infrastructure is. But it's a big issue, and yet here we are talking about trying to create new energy and new water resources just to be able to funnel them into AI and data centers. It is really crazy. Anyway, so it's raining. I'm delighted. I hope we get more of it. And if anybody thinks, well, we'd rather it was sunny, then we've had sun pretty much non-stop for 4 months. So I think it's time for some rain.
Mike.
I mean, it is quite amazing that it is really raining probably for about the third day this year in Plymouth. This is it's fairly unprecedented. Of course, that's not a climate. I'm not suggesting that's a climate issue. That's a weather issue. And this particular year, it has been pretty dry, as Charles says. So I suppose we should be welcoming it. The question is whether it's going to stop raining now between now and Christmas. And that's another thing, because Plymouth is right in the west of England, and we are pretty much the first to get the Atlantic weather systems that come through. And of course, these days they get named because we've all got to be full of fear. I grew up in Northern Ireland, as we talked about before, Jerm, and that is similarly battered by Atlantic weather systems, and this is perfectly normal. We didn't need to name them for all my life, and suddenly we've decided we've got to name them, just in the same way that we've decided we've got to turn temperatures of 20 degrees on the weather map red, so that we know that we're in danger.
There's a great segue there. Speaking about water, if my connection is problematic during the course of this conversation, it is because we have a damaged undersea cable running along the African continent, which is currently, I believe, being repaired. So it has created issues with
Did the Russians do that?
most likely the Russians. It's always the Russians or the Chinese, Mike. It's either the Russians or the Chinese. So it's somewhere off the northern horn or somewhere there. I don't know where the problem is. But in any event, if there's an issue, it's simply because of that cable connecting me to the rest of the world. But that's a very interesting thought. You don't often think about something like that. So, like, if you go into your street and you look at the cables, running along, it's not very far, right? And so, if you think about cables that run throughout your suburb, you start thinking, well, that's really long. Think about how long an undersea cable is. It is unbelievably long, and it leads us to globalization. And there's a point that I want to make, because people often get confused between globalism and globalization. And I thought this could be a great opportunity just to discuss quickly what those two terms mean. Let's see if you agree, because I've been trying to figure out the difference between the two because they get used interchangeably. So globalism is an ideological term, which effectively means central control of everything, right? And globalization is merely the technical connectivity of the world, like using ships to take containers around, or undersea cables connecting us. It's not an ideological thing. It's just making trade and movement easier. But globalism is an ideology. Would you agree?
Not entirely. I think that globalization is an outgrowth of globalism, and so I don't think you can separate them necessarily. I think that the style of global trade, because it's not just global trade. We've always traded with other countries for thousands of years. We've traded with other countries in Ireland, in England. There's a ton of evidence of trade between Britain as it was and the Middle East and Africa and so on. So there's always been trade between nations over there was no such thing as nations necessarily, but trade between peoples over quite long distances. I think what globalization has done, and I would argue that is an outgrowth of globalism, is it has made supply chains reliant on that distance, which paradoxically doesn't. We talk about the lack of internal consistency in people's arguments, but the same people that are pushing the climate change narrative and the idea that we've got to, reduce carbon emissions are the same people that are pushing the idea that we've got to make a bit of an aircraft in this country and another bit of an aircraft in that country, or we've got to grow some food in the United States and import it into the United Kingdom or from New Zealand or whatever it happens to be. These two positions seem to be inconsistent, to say the least, and sort of gives an idea of just how stupid the whole thing really is. But I think you can't separate the two in the way that you're suggesting, but that's just my opinion.
I think I go along with the. Well, first of all, I'm not sure, Jerm, that you necessarily meant there was a very clear distinction between the two. That there has to be, in a way, by definition, some sort of overlap. It's just a question of, I suppose, which drives which. If one can even suggest that there's a case for saying either way. I would go along with there being a strong relationship between the two. I would all, and going back to what Mike says, I think what is very interesting is in a way, and somewhat paradoxically, the outcome of trying to have a sort of a world system which involves these, let's say, globalistic lines of communication, whether they be trade routes or whatever, there is an inherent over-complexity with them, in that what seems to be attempted or has been done to a certain extent is to make direct connections from A to B, rather than, in the historic context, using the points along the way. So, as Mike says, as people in the British Isles have without doubt traded with and had a relationship with peoples all over the world for a very long time, but perhaps not in a direct context. Whereas now, if we're talking about, and we're forever being bombarded with sort of show-off trade deals with, doesn't matter who, Taiwan, let's say Taiwan's a bad example, but it doesn't matter. So somewhere that's further flung, and what is implicit in that statement is that is a direct connection, doesn't take into account any of the things, any of the points in between, and geography is important. And previously, where things would be traded along a route, you could see the sense in that, and also you could see the benefit to people along the way. Whereas now, and we're seeing this to a certain extent with the sort of Trump tariff mayhem and associated nonsense. I mean, he's now come out talking about, I haven't looked at the list, but I suppose it's fairly predictable, countries from which people may not enter the United States and all this sort of thing. So the relationships that are now held between countries don't really make sense. I mean, they might make sense on some level in that, yes, it's possible to fly an aircraft from one place to another place over a whole load of other ones. But is that really the most sensible way to do it? And why? On the Wednesday's news, well, I mean, we've been talking about it for some time. I spoke about the Strategic Defence Review, which is just come out, and it's the nutshell version is that we are all going to be at war with Russia as a nation. I mean, all of us, not just the armed forces, but everybody. We're going to have a whole society war. The entire economy is going to be geared towards it. We're going to funnel billions into the war industry, and we are going to absolutely engage with nuclear and all the rest of it. But it doesn't make any sense, because it's not actually really deliverable, and it's part of, without doubt, that is part of fits, I would say, within your globalism definition, but because of the sort of bit by bit piecemeal way in which things are done, it sounds like a total and utter nonsense. And I think that is applied to frankly whatever we're doing. Again, the it doesn't matter whether trade relationships, diplomatic relationships, whatever, they don't really seem to work. So I think there is a lot of overlap between the two terms that you put out.
It is interesting that as time goes on and I speak to more people, the difference in attitude or the difference in understanding of what the United Nations is between those in the West, the so-called global West, and those in the so-called global South. And I think that the people in the global South view the United Nations as something quite different and something that has the potential to actually put some kind of restriction or limitation on the activities of the global West. I'm not suggesting that is an accurate view that they hold, but that's certainly a view that they hold. They seem to think that the UN Charter has teeth as I say, I'm not suggesting that I agree with that position. I'm just saying that that's a view that has been expressed. So it is interesting that even if we take take Agenda 2030 and the Millennium Development Goals, our understanding of that, because we see what is being published and said by the various think tanks and policymakers in the West, our understanding of what those represent and what the ultimate destination of the Millennium Development Goals is very different to the understanding of a country that actually just wants to feed its people. And part of the issue is that even today, having seen what's happened in the last 100 years, many countries and many people in the global South aren't quite cynical enough about the motivations of some of the policymakers in the West for their own good, I would suggest. And so it is interesting how people view the United Nations. That's a bit of a diversion, but I just thought I'd make that point.
Yeah, well, I think it's a point absolutely worth making, and also, within that, considering the perceived benefits of the United Nations to all of those different parts, particularly in terms of whether it be money or infrastructure projects, or the types of sort of involvement that any country has with the UN. But actually, again, that's another. You're talking about shipping food around the world. Well, that's absolutely case in point. That's precisely what I'm talking about. You have an organisation with as you say, a globalist ideology or background. But does it really make sense to be shipping food from one point thousands of miles away to somewhere else, or would it be better sourced absolutely next door? Well, I mean, that's getting into a sort of a different thing, because again,
is it though? Because what would Britain be like if we decided instead of orienting around a war footing, we actually recognise that we're only 40% food independent in this country, and let's organise around food production instead. It would be just as beneficial in terms of jobs and growth in the country, but perhaps the motivation would be more positive.
What do you mean?
Well,
Sorry.
No, go on, Charles.
Do you mean to turn the focus of the economy onto self-sufficiency? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. I mean, if only.
I wouldn't be talking from Cape Town to you.
Well, no, but I think that's the thing. You would, but the. Okay, we're talking about your undersea cable. I must say, I don't know exactly.
No. I mean, what I mean is, yeah, well, that too. But what I mean is, ultimately, historically based on the Dutch East India Company, ancestry, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for, I guess, those shipping routes.
Yes, but then, okay, it slightly depends at which point in time we sort of land on or draw a line from. But trade to down to South Africa from Europe was not, for a point in time, was not direct. I mean, it was, there were stops along the way, either, mostly via the sea, obviously, initially, but also overland. So the point is that any of these places that were arrived at, I mean, even, South Africa, again, as a staging post on a voyage elsewhere. I mean, there was a relevance to everywhere along the way, and that's the point I think I was trying to make earlier, was that all that stuff has been forgotten. The relationships of places to one another have been forgotten. We everything now is like it's sort of, I don't know if they still print them, but aircraft used to have maps of all their routes, the airlines' routes, and they all just were from one place to everywhere else in the world, and it was all about the whether it was London or Paris or whatever, as opposed to a route from London through Paris, through Berlin, or whatever. And I think we are just the poorer and more vulnerable for it. That the sense of sort of economic or other integrity via a relationship that actually makes sense, a trade route that makes sense, I think is something we've lost.
Yeah, but you're making an argument for decentralization, actually, which is a good argument.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, possibly.
Which is
I mean, I would
opposite
definitely make it. Yeah.
But I mean, that's the undercurrent. The undercurrent is that globalism is about centralization, and you're making the argument for decentralization, which is ultimately, we know, the better outcome for most things. That's why I was starting off by saying globalism, I'm suggesting it's not a positive thing, because it's all about central control. Whereas globalization, like us talking via undersea cables, etc., is just the consequence of technological progress.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense, or
yeah,
not?
No, it does. It does. I hope I haven't trapped myself in a perpetual cycle of nonsense. But yes, you are quite right in that I am talking about decentralization. I think what I'm. Yes, I mean that is a very good point. But it's as though. I think what I'm trying to say is that when you put it forward that there was an ideology and then in effect a sort of a delivery system, I think what I'm suggesting is that ironically or paradoxically the delivery system via globalisation is actually not the most effective for pushing through the ideology. I mean that's not a tip to Klaus Schwab or anyone else, but I do think there is there's an inherent vulnerability in having these I would say sort of disconnected networks of whether they are trade or diplomacy or whatever.
Let me potentially stab myself in the foot and suggest that when I use the example of undersea cables, I personally see that as a good thing because it allows me to access the world from the bottom of the African continent via information and chatting to you gentlemen and so on and so forth, right? You could argue that likely is being used for bad, nefarious things, and I have no doubt about that whatsoever. I mean, we know that the cyber future is under threat. But think about Starlink. Now, that could be the inversion of what I was just talking about, because the connectivity already exists. Now, that is a different type of connectivity, which I think is tightly connected to mass surveillance and the collection of data, which is ideological more than it is practical.
Starlink's more than that. I mean, it's effectively a defense organization because it is being used. It is being deployed as a weapon. It is being used for military purposes in certain countries, but increasingly the global internet is also being weaponized, as you've just hinted at by using the word surveillance. But the entire internet from the beginning, to some degree, has been predicated on this opportunity and opportunism by certain people to use it for that purpose. But at the end of the day, it's a piece of infrastructure, and like any piece of infrastructure, it could be used for positive or negative purposes. It depends who's in the driving seat at the time. I think just to make one final point on your globalism versus globalization question. I think that the difference between what happened because as we've said, there's always been this global aspect to trade, but the difference between what happened in the past and what's happening now is that when trade happened, it was because country A produced certain goods which were perhaps useful to country B, and country B produced certain goods which were perhaps useful to country A, and those things were effectively swapped in some form of trade. What's happened in recent decades, of course, is that country A no longer produces anything useful, and country A attempts to exploit the differences in the cost of labour in country B in order to produce stuff more cheaply or whatever, and therefore make bigger profits. That I think is the real danger of the policies that the West has pursued over the last decades, because actually in not too many more years there won't be anybody left in our countries that remembers how to do certain things. And this sort of goes back to Charles's point about the Strategic Defence Review. I'm not convinced. Even if they wanted to, as Charles was saying, even if they wanted to do what they're suggesting they want to do, it's not actually achievable because A, they don't have the skills. They don't actually have the intelligence or the capability to pull it off. So the whole idea is stupid and will result in disaster for this country if it is pursued, if people don't oppose it. But this applies to globalism, and how globalisation has been done. It's not, globalisation in itself isn't a bad thing, as you're suggesting, Jerm, but it's the way it's being done is absolutely detrimental to all our to all our lives, in my opinion, and that doesn't just apply to people in the West, because people in the so-called global South are absolutely exploited by it, left, right, and centre. So, yeah, nothing else to add to that.
I remember when I had the great pleasure of chatting to John McAfee before he was Epstein, and he made the point that paranoia is a very good thing. And paranoia is what led him to developing antivirus software before there were viruses.
I think we should be absolutely paranoid. I think there's no question that our governments are out to get us. There's no degrees about it. We should be absolutely paranoid. Our governments are out to get us, and that is. I mean, and this really is the nub of it, isn't it? Is who is our enemy? It's we've got to keep our focus on who the enemy actually is. It begins with our governments, and then you start working out from there to various heads of corporations and because if we're talking about the global West having exploited the global South over a couple of centuries or whatever it is. That actually ordinary people in Western countries are in a sense the same as the global South, because we are equally being asset stripped and exploited, just as Africans were during the 19th century and so on. It's quite incredible to watch, and in the meantime we're being convinced that we have to pay our taxes to make sure that the National Health Service is allowed to give pharmaceutical companies big profits, but and we have to pay increasingly corporatized and centrally controlled food companies in order for them to have the right to poison us with hyper-processed foods and so on. Even using the word food for those kinds of products is completely inappropriate. It is incredible how we are absolutely unwilling to consider the possibility that we are the targets for massive exploitation, the likes of which only certain countries experienced in the past.
But speaking of paranoia, I flew a few years ago. I flew to Australia, and I remember when I was in Sydney at the luggage terminal, where the luggage is coming on that what do you call that, conveyor belt thing, and mine was the only luggage on the flight that was wrapped in bubble wrap, and it had straps around it and all sorts of stuff, and so that's how I knew it was my luggage, because nobody else had luggage looking like that. And I took it off the conveyor belt, and this American woman next to me goes, "Are you from South Africa?" I said yes. She says, "I knew it."
Yeah, no, that's a very good anecdote, and absolutely, I understand that completely. But just go back one. What do you mean by paranoia?
Well, that's the feeling that they're all out to get us, is it?
Yeah, I mean that there are nefarious agendas and nefarious people. Okay.
Yeah, all right. I mean, I would go along with that. But to me, paranoia sounds like a negative state to be in that it seems to have inherent within it a level of fear and therefore stress. And I consider that to be not a positive way to think. And I would say that always, regardless of the situation, the only thing one wants to be considering is how to take a positive action, and so I think to be circumspect, to be skeptical, to be aware, yes, absolutely. I think I would stop short of saying that I know this might sound like a pedantic point to make, but I would say that stopping short of paranoia, I think, is where I'd end up. And actually going back to the baggage carousel thing. Carousel, I think, is the word you were looking for.
That's right, carousel.
Because we've all jumped on them at some point and had the alarm go off, haven't we? I would never ever wrap my bag up in that wretched cling film stuff. I would never do it. And the reason I would never do it is that if someone wants to pinch my bag or destroy it or take something out of it, cling film's just not going to stop them. And I think it's all about committing effort. Sorry, that's not a really deliberate pop at you, by the way. The way that I think the world should work is that, or at least for us, if we're confronting these sorts of points of view, is that you have to put in the effort where it's going to count, where it's going to make a difference. And things like I'll give you an example: the car alarm. I mean, there have been a lot of utterly pointless things invented over the years, but the car alarm. I mean, seriously, whatever was that for? The only time they go off is wrong. I drove on the way to Plymouth yesterday morning. I drove past a transporter lorry with 2 tiers of vehicles on it, and the car at the very back on the lower deck, its alarm was going off. I just thought, it's just classic. So there it was, flashing lights. How incredibly annoying for the driver of the transporter that his rear vehicle, nothing you could do about it, just car alarm going off. And so the point I'm trying to make via in a way a deliberately stupid example is that an induced state of paranoia, I'm afraid to say, I just do not see as being productive, and also I see it as surrendering control to the wrong side, and to consider that somebody is doing something to you rather than you are the doer. You are taking the situation on its own merits and then deciding what's going to happen. And yes, to anyone who's wondering still why I wouldn't cling film my bag, yeah, I have had stuff nicked out of bags, but there we go. I'm still here, and I think that's the point. I would say that with all these situations, with all these thoughts, you've just got to consider it in such a way that you turn it to your advantage and to your sort of self-improvement.
Yeah. And I just want to add that I also agree with Charles as well. I was being utterly flippant with the use of the term, but and really the point there was who should be the focus of whatever urge for resistance that we have, and so it was perhaps playing loose with the term, but and I completely agree with you, Charles. Whatever's going on in this world, we should not be interacting with it from a position of fear.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, if I think the words used were, the governments are out to get us, let's say. Well, so what? Because how really is that to be achieved? Let's say the sort of the cave scenario. If we didn't work for UK Column and we didn't put out a news programme and research all these things, and we got on with our lives within this idea of being in a nation that was self-sufficient. I mean, okay, this is an absolutely ludicrous situation to be putting out there, because it might never happen. Let's not say won't, because there was a point in time where it did because it had to. And don't forget that this is what drives everything, is necessity. And I go right back to the beginning where I talk about the rain here, and the only reason people do just drift about the place listening to their whatever those radioactive earpod things are called, not having a clue, is because there's no necessity. They don't need to think about water because all that's spoon-fed, all that's done for them, and that's sort of what this comes back to, I think, is this idea of necessity, which largely has been lost. But so if we were in a situation where we were not aware of the sorts of things that we do know about, and therefore are able to form judgments like the government are out to get us because they have said blah, 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 blah. Actually, how would we know? And okay, I say that from a position of being in a rural environment where I don't see anybody who works for the state ever. I mean, occasionally the people come past and pick the rubbish up, but if they didn't, it wouldn't be the end of the world. There'd be a way to deal with it, and that's it. Okay, I know that's one thing. If you're in let's say if you're in an urban environment, the likelihood is you will see people who are working for some state agency, but probably in an oblique sense, they're not actually there to necessarily deal with you. So this is not an advert for people to switch off and not watch UK column news, by the way. I should make that very clear. But the point is that if you're not thinking about it and then allowing it to corrupt your thoughts and make you feel helpless and that it is taking control of your life, then you're sort of moving into dangerous and I would say wrong territory. So yes, awareness, but use that. And so that's why, going back onto the why you should watch UK column news bit. But the reason you should is because there is a higher sense of being and a higher sense of purpose in that empowerment of knowing what these people are trying to do and understanding how to make that inform your life choices in a positive sense.
So, like, for example, the government or the state, they are, or it is out to get you. I think that's its purpose.
Yeah.
It is out to get you, to control you and the society at large. But that's in the abstract, because there are individuals who work in various departments who genuinely believe that they're doing a good thing and they're trying to make, their society better.
Makes perfect sense to me, and that's that brings us right to the heart of what we do, which is the fact that we are in an information war. And if you present two people with a shared set of values, let's say, exactly like the people you're talking about, and I can totally corroborate that. I mean, I've worked for two of the sort of so-called state agencies, the army and the police, and I know that makes certain people bridle because they wonder why on earth I should therefore be speaking on a platform such as this. Well, fair enough. I mean, people are entirely entitled to their views, but what I would say is that gives me absolutely gold-plated insight into how these organisations work and what sorts of people they do attract, good and bad. And I've absolutely seen the bad, and I'm not going to shy away from that, although the point that we're discussing here is really the good. So the thing is, if you put people who do have shared values and, in a sense, an inherent core of, let's say, good, but you present them with two different sets of information, then you would expect the outcomes to be different, which is why it is so dangerous to introduce narratives like climate change, for example. Here we are talking about dry weather and then some rain, which I know perfectly well is weather, exactly like Mike said at the beginning. But of course, if you're told that it's climate and therefore it concerns carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases and blah, 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 then the outcomes that you think you desire are going to be different. It's a terrible, terrible problem. And so that's the way that this should be treated, I would say.
The climate change narrative, though, is part of that invisible boogeyman agenda. You can't see it, and whenever there's a change in weather, it's climate change, it's because you drove a diesel car. It's your fault, or you left your light bulb on for too long. Your incandescent light bulb, which, by the way, is actually healthier to use than an LED light, which most people don't know, or the other invisible one is the pandemic, because remember, you can't see it. Right, so you have to trust what you're being told. There are a couple other invisible boogeymen. Bill Gates actually mentioned 4 in an interview recently. And the problem here, and we spoke about this previously, is that because it's Bill Gates, you'll dismiss everything he says. And that's a bad idea, because he can actually tell you what he's thinking. And you should listen sometimes. So when he says things like, we need to be prepared for climate change, which is the one invisible boogeyman. The other he mentioned was more pandemics. What was the other one? It was nuclear war. I mean, we've never seen that actually play out. We've only ever been threatened from the Cold War era. We don't know actually if nuclear war can actually be a real thing. We just think it can. And then what was the other one he said? There was one other. I've gone blank now. I think it was AI. That was the other one. Yes, AI taking control of everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, the invisibility thing, because, of course, one might say that it works both ways, in that I would totally agree with you that if you want to make money and be able to control people, then the spectre of something, rather than having to actually produce a monster, is a much more effective way of doing it. Because in a sense, people's imaginations do the work for you. You just suggest there's whether it be a deadly pandemic or a climate, this, that, and the other. And you don't even need to bother to substantiate your claim in any way. People will just run away with it. So yeah, I mean, it's an absolute gift. I would say not exactly the counter to it, but of course the other side of it is that we are in a position now where we look at things that are supposedly sort of in the pipeline, like, let's say, a digital identity system or a central bank digital currency, which does sort of exist in some places and does sort of work in some places. Yeah, okay, but not in the main. They're not. I mean, in the UK, you can exist perfectly easily without a digital identity or a central bank digital currency, and yet I'm describing them as things that you can't really see, but they are, certainly by people that are aware of them, they are being considered as something that should be feared. And I know we've talked about this a lot before. I'm not trying to dismiss the pitfalls and indeed the fact that they can be turned into a reality, but I think I would like to qualify any sense of fear around those ideas or those realities. I think the motto in life that I would happily pinch from my days as a soldier is adapt and overcome. And if it happens, okay, you're not going to embrace it, but there will be a way. And I think we are very quick to do ourselves down. People have come up with ingenious workarounds all the way through the ages, and I think we just haven't had enough pressure on us to come up with these sorts of things. But also, I would again look at the positives and the places where, in particular, digital currency has been tried, certainly on a central banking, in a central banking capacity. It has failed absolutely spectacularly. Nigeria and Jamaica being the two obvious examples. It's a complete and utter flop. And so for the Bank of England or whoever else to put out this, because it's very easy, you write up some snazzy looking PDF document and send it around the place and get parliamentary committees to talk about it, and then you, in a way, you've sort of jacked up your idea like there's a pandemic. You've created the sense that this thing is real and it is happening and you're all going to be part of it. And actually the truth is that is total rubbish. It is just a fiction, and we need to be really mindful of that. So yes, be aware, and that going back to the sort of paranoia thing, be aware, be mindful of it, but also reject it entirely, and we'll find those workarounds. We have to do that. If we don't think like that, then we are just shooting ourselves in the feet.
The other thing I would add to that is that I'm going to be talking about this on the next UK Column News programme, but I was watching the Ofcom live seminar, we might call it, on the part of the Online Safety Act, which is about protecting children. And one of the core sort of tenets of this was we've got to protect children online because children are using online services and they're exposed to all kinds of potential harms on the internet. And it was a whole day event And it began with a little propaganda piece, which was a bunch of parents talking about the harms that their children had been exposed to on the internet and the effect that it had on their children. And the entire sort of the entire basis of the whole initiative is that it is wholly incumbent upon the platforms, the services on the internet to keep children safe. At no point in the discussion was there any consideration of the role of parents. And, I just find this whole approach totally about face, and really actually we should be saying to parents, it's all right to restrict access to certain types of content on the internet. In fact, we're not saying that. We're saying the opposite. We're almost telling parents, you have zero role in the upbringing of your children. It's completely, and of course we understand why this is the case, because it's because the basis of this entire approach is about narrative control and the effort to regain a foothold in the minds of younger people and make sure that younger people aren't being given access to certain types of information, and the threat of pornography or other harms on the internet is being used as a tool for that. But it just fascinated me that they were quite happy to present this idea that parents were complaining that at the lack of action from the platforms to protect their children, while at no point did the parents consider protecting their own children themselves. And this is, I think, indicative of something which I suppose was expressed through the pandemic in particular. This notion that the role of the state is to keep people safe. Now, you could say that historically, the role of the king or whatever was to keep people safe, but this has been taken to an entire different degree, to the point where, because it's been twisted, that in order for us to keep you safe, you've got to submit to certain limitations, and it is without question attempting to build a level of control that we haven't seen over people's lives that we haven't seen previously, and so that should be resisted. But I think it keeps saying this. It all begins with choices that we make as individuals, and whether we're willing to take agency for our own existence, which I suppose echoes a lot of what Charles has said today.
A lot of people around me, I noticed, don't see the psychological war that's going on. Very subliminal, extremely subliminal, where it's always about shifting responsibility to the corporations or to the state, and I think it's also a consequence of entitlement. It's everybody has too many rights. That's my personal view. People have got too many rights. It's my right. It's my right. It's my right. And it's always my right. And who enforces the right? It's the state. It's never the personal responsibility. And look at the messaging that came out during the COVID era. It was about, we will protect you. It's always about putting the emphasis on the bigger structures, the bigger power structures. And what ultimately happens is that you end up with very obedient, very compliant peasantry, effectively, at the end of the day.
So just to clarify, you would remove everybody's rights?
I think so. No. I mean, I often joke. I'll say that I'm a monarchist anarchist. So I oppose the state unless I am the state. But I mean, ultimately,
so you're happy to be a dictator yourself,
but I'll be benevolent.
I think it is a serious issue. I'm very happy to jump into this complete mess in that I think rights. I think I see exactly where you're coming from. In that, what I would say is that rights really are nothing more than a tool of control, because they are something written down that can therefore be rescinded and
enforced.
And enforced. I mean, and also they are perfect for divide and rule. You set one load of rights against another, or the rights of an individual against those of a group, or different individuals. So the way in which rights have come to be manipulated, whether or not that was intentional, and it doesn't really matter whether people do believe that to have been intentional or not. And we go back to things like, even the things like the UN Charter. I mean, the point is, the moment you write something down, and look at what the whatever she's called, the head lady of the ICRC, is now saying, I mean, admittedly, incredibly belatedly, about the situation in Gaza. It's the same with international humanitarian law. It doesn't matter. Whatever you write down will be manipulated. And we spoke about this last week. We talked about fundamental principles. And, Jerm, you talked about free will. You've spoken about free will, I think, on the previous sessions we've done. And so overarching guiding principles like that are much easier, let's put it the other way around, much harder to manipulate and to create compliant slaves with. So although perhaps we might come at it from a slightly different angle, I do agree with you on the rights issue, which is not to say that people should not be able to do stuff. I mean, that's not at all what either of us would mean by it. But no, I mean, I totally agree. The problem is, if you put your faith in rights, I believe you are on a hiding to nothing, because it will absolutely be turned against you.
Let me just come in there, because there's two types of rights that exist today. Historically, certainly in recent centuries, if we look at the constitutions of the UK or the United States, there was not necessarily expressed explicitly, but there was the principle of God-given unalienable rights, certain rights that everybody is entitled to. But those were perceived, or they were written down, or they were agreed that these came from a higher power. Anyway, what happened with the UN Charter and subsequently was that the idea of human rights came along. And I think that's where the danger about rights comes from. Because once you say that a right is conferred to one human from another human, that is putting the other human in a position above the human that gets the right. The fundamental problem with human rights is it starts with a blank piece of paper. It starts with the idea that you have no rights, and then you start adding rights to those. But if a human being is giving a right to another human being, then that human being can take that right away again at some future point. So I would say that societies can organize around some fundamental principles, which we might call unalienable rights that are sort of universal and come from something outside of humanity and can't be removed. And we can agree that there's, like the right to life, for example, there are some fundamental rights that are just obvious. The issue for me is once you start bringing that to a human level, because you've removed God from the equation. And I'm not saying that you have to believe in a higher power, although it's obviously easier if you do. But you have to at least agree that there's a principle above humanity, which in other words, a human being can't remove certain fundamental rights from people. I think that is important, even no matter, it's an important distinction between what's happened in more recent decades as opposed to what was considered reasonable previously.
Sorry, I should have said I absolutely meant human rights, the way in which human rights have been legislated and so forth. But yes, what you end up with is not only that these have been sort of confected and conferred by humans to other humans, which is an extraordinary situation to start with, but also it means that the state, as the arbiter, is looked towards to sort out and resolve these issues. So straight away you're creating an imbalance, or this ridiculous situation where people feel that they have all agency and sort of consciousness taken away from them. Why can't people just work this stuff out for themselves? And in fact, I think that goes exactly back to what Mike was talking about with Ofcom and with parenting. And okay, there have been many other factors over the years, but it really does appear that the internet in particular has driven people completely mad. Because if you were to say 20 or 30 years ago, to go into a household where 2 or 3 small children live and say to the parents, if you could just tell me, I'm just doing a survey this week, how many stabbings and shootings have you hosted inside your home, and how many sex shows have you had between the hours of 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the afternoon in your kitchen? And obviously the answer by the horrified parents would in most cases be none at all, don't be ridiculous, get out. Whereas with the internet, it's a total inversion of that. People think nothing of having all this stuff going on in their house, but because it's the internet, somehow it's different. And people, parents, I think in particular, it's as though they are absolved of that. And I think that is all absolutely part of this idea that the state is there to control and protect, and if things go wrong, then it's the state's problem, and it's only the state that can fix it, and that's a terrible place to find yourself.
Yeah, I don't know whether the internet in itself can be blamed for that, though, because isn't it? I mean, I think this rot set in actually a lot earlier, and it the whole issue of individualism and why, okay, I've had a child now, but why should that child occupy my time? I've got to go and play football, or I've got to whatever it happens to be. It seems to me it's something significantly more fundamental than just the internet. It's coming back to the idea of giving something to the next generation. We've lost that somehow. Children are perceived by most parents as just being an inconvenience. Just shove a phone in their hand because it gets them out of the way. It's not that I'm not sure if I'm expressing this very well, but it just seems to me that parents actually, for whatever reason, don't really want to be parents anymore. They don't want to spend time with children. They just want to stick them in a room and let them entertain themselves. I think that the fact that the internet is there is a convenience. But if it wasn't the internet, it would be something else.
It might be. I mean, I think, again, I don't know how definitive one can ever consider this sort of data to be, but there are, statistics which show that people's time, the way in which people's time has been taken up over the years has transformed so radically towards spending time on the internet. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that it's the internet that's corrupted people's minds and behaviour insofar as what they're viewing, but it's the sheer length of time or the distraction of the internet itself. But no, yes. I mean, I absolutely agree with you, and it's a trend, and it's, you could say this has been the purpose of television in large part, etc. There are plenty of other influences, but it does seem that the internet as a driver for this, and specifically relating to Ofcom, it is a massive factor.
Gents, look at the time. Let's come in for landing. Let's do the obligatory support UK column. and watch my show, and watch the news, which soon will be daily.
Yeah,
that's the plan. But look, I mean, look, we do need support, and we obviously need financial support. We absolutely appreciate and just once again thank everybody that is supporting us financially. But equally important, as far as I'm concerned, is just be willing to share because and try to promote what it is we're doing. If you like what we're doing, then please do share it, because I mean we just can't express how. I mean, everybody knows how much how big an impact the censorship regime has, and there is no doubt that when we engage with people that haven't come across us before, we often get a positive response. But the fact is that still the majority of people, no matter how many people were aware of us during lockdown and on the marches and so on, and the idea that lots of people are aware of the UK column, actually, it's still quite a small proportion of the population of this country or any other country around the world. So, just encourage everybody to share as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think just one sec, sorry, just to add to that, also share the things that you are doing, that where you have achieved effect, share that with us, because we rebroadcast it, and that does show people that changes can be made and that people can make ground and do stuff. So it's a two-way street.
Mike Robertson, Charles Mallett, thank you for joining me in the weekly Banter Trenches.